There is a theory, not a loud one, not the kind that shouts from headlines or demands you believe it before you have heard a word. This one moves quietly, the way old things tend to move, through the cracks in stone monuments and the margins of ancient texts, through the sediment at the bottom of lakes and the dim memory of myths that people have been telling each other for so long that no one remembers why they started. The theory goes like this. Roughly 12,000 years ago, something happened. Something large enough to end one world and force whatever was left of it to begin again. This is called by some the Great Reset. Not a political event, not a conspiracy of boardrooms and shadowy committees, but a geological and perhaps civilizational rupture so profound that it erased what came before it and left only the faintest impressions behind. Impressions pressed into stone, carried in the mouths of storytellers, written in the slow record of ice cores and ocean floors. Tonight, you are going to move through that theory slowly. There is no rush here. The intention is not to convince you of anything, but to take you on a long, calm walk through the evidence that people point to when they make this claim, through the ruins of places that should not exist according to our standard timeline, through flood myths that appear in nearly every culture on Earth, through carvings that some researchers believe encode a memory of catastrophe so precise it borders on the impossible. You will look at all of it with open eyes and a quiet mind, and you will let the strangeness of it settle without needing to resolve it before morning. The 12,000-year mark matters because it corresponds to the end of the last ice age, a boundary in time so dramatic that geologists gave it a name, the Younger Dryas, a period when enormous ice sheets that had covered vast portions of the northern hemisphere began their long retreat, when sea levels rose, when climates shifted so rapidly that entire ecosystems collapsed. Something happened at the close of that period, or perhaps because of it, that rearranged the world in ways we are still attempting to understand. And it is into that turning point that the Great Reset theory reaches, looking for the outline of something older than we thought possible. The central evidence in these claims is physical, not just story, not just symbol, but stone, monuments arranged with a precision that troubles researchers even today, carvings that appear to depict astronomical events spanning thousands of years, structures found submerged beneath shallow coastal seas, resting on land that was dry ground before the glaciers melted and the oceans climbed. Each of these will have its moment in this journey. Each one is a piece of a larger and still incomplete picture. What you will also encounter is the tension that lives at the centre of all of this. Mainstream archaeology approaches these questions with specific tools, specific standards, and a framework built carefully from decades of fieldwork. Alternative researchers, some trained and credentialed, others working entirely outside the academy, look at the same stones and see something the framework has not yet made room for. Neither side is simply right, neither is simply wrong. The argument between them is genuinely interesting, and tonight you will hear it not as a battle, but as a conversation. The kind that tends to happen in low voices, late at night when certainty has gone to bed and curiosity is still awake. So settle in, let the day fall away. What follows is a long, slow walk through lost worlds, the evidence of their ending, and the strange, durable marks they may have left behind for anyone patient enough to look. The stones have been waiting 12,000 years. They are in no hurry. To understand why 12,000 years ago sits at the centre of this theory, you have to understand what the world actually looked like just before that moment. Not the world we know, not the world of maps and coastlines you grew up studying. A different world, colder and stranger, where ice stretched down from the poles in sheets kilometres thick, where the ocean sat roughly 120 metres below where it rests today, and where the land that now lies beneath the shallow coastal seas of every continent was open ground, walked on, lived on, shaped by wind and weather, under an open sky. This was the late Pleistocene, and it had been cold for a very long time. long enough for entire landscapes to form that no longer exist, long enough for human populations to spread across land bridges now swallowed by rising water, long enough for the world to settle into a certain kind of stability, the stability of deep cold, where the ice was old and the patterns were old, and life had arranged itself around them the way life always does. And then, beginning roughly 15 to 16,000 years ago, that arrangement began to come apart. The warming was not gentle, it was not a slow and steady improvement like the end of a long winter. It was fitful, interrupted, marked by surges and reversals that would have been dramatic within a single human lifetime. Ice sheets that had been stable for thousands of years began carving and retreating. Glacial lakes trapped behind walls of ice grew enormous, then catastrophically released, sending pulses of cold fresh water into the North Atlantic in volumes almost impossible to picture. The sea rose, not all at once but persistently, and in certain periods quite rapidly, swallowing coastlines at rates that communities living near them would have witnessed and remembered. The world was reorganizing itself at a pace that left marks everywhere, in the sediment record, in the pollen trapped in lake beds, in the oxygen isotopes locked inside ancient ice. Then came the Younger Dryas. This is where the story becomes genuinely strange. Around 12,900 years ago, just as the warming appeared to be settling into something lasting, the climate lurched backward. Temperatures in parts of the northern hemisphere dropped sharply, in some regions falling nearly as fast as they had been climbing, returning to near glacial conditions within what geologists believe was a matter of decades. Some estimates suggest the transition happened even faster than that. The Younger Dryas lasted for roughly 1,200 years, a long cold interruption, before ending just as abruptly around 11,700 years ago, with temperatures in Greenland rising perhaps 10 degrees within a single human generation. The cause of the Younger Dryas remains one of the more actively debated questions in quaternary science. The traditional explanation involves a disruption of the Atlantic Ocean circulation system, likely triggered by a massive influx of cold freshwater from melting glaciers. This is well supported by evidence and widely accepted. But in recent decades, a separate hypothesis has gathered attention, and it is the one that feeds most directly into the reset theory you're following tonight. A group of researchers drawing on evidence from multiple sites across the globe has proposed that the onset of the Younger Dryas was triggered or significantly accelerated by a cosmic impact event, fragments of a comet or asteroid striking or exploding above the ice sheet, igniting widespread fires, throwing material into the atmosphere, and destabilizing the climate in ways that cascading effects then prolonged. This is known as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and its story will have its own place in this journey. For now, what matters is simply knowing it exists, that science itself has not closed the door on a dramatic skyborne event at this very moment in time. What the changing environment certainly did, regardless of what caused it, was erase. It erased landscapes. It erased coastlines. It erased the archaeological record of anything that had been built or buried near sea level during the long cold period before the warming began. When the sea rose 120 meters, it did not leave a sign at the door. It simply covered what was there, slowly in the long view of geology, rapidly in the experience of anyone alive to watch it. Settlements built on those coastal plains, and there would however been many because humans have always preferred coasts, vanished beneath shallow water without anyone cataloguing what they had been. This is one of the most important and genuinely underappreciated facts about the archaeological record. We have done extraordinary work excavating the land that has remained dry. We have done almost nothing in comparison beneath the shallow seas, where so much of the human world once stood. The absence of evidence from those places is not evidence of absence. It is a silence created by water, and that silence is exactly where the reset theory builds some of its most compelling foundations. There is something else worth sitting with. Environments do not just erase structures, They erase memory. When populations are disrupted, when they scatter, when the food systems they depended on collapse and the landscapes they understood vanish under water or ice or transformed climate, the institutional knowledge they carried, the careful accumulation of observation and technique and cosmology can break, can scatter into fragments, can survive only in the distorted forms of story and myth and ritual, repeated by people who no longer fully understand what the original held. This is not speculation. It is a pattern documented across cultures that have faced sudden disruption. And it is the mechanism that makes a global reset story feel not just emotionally resonant, but structurally plausible, at least as a question worth asking. Something this large, a climate reversal this sudden, a sea rise this comprehensive, happening across the span of a few thousand years centered on a period we can actually identify, would not have passed through human experience without leaving marks. The question the theory is really asking is whether any of those marks survive, and whether we have yet learned how to read them. Around 12,900 years ago, something happened in the sky above North America. What exactly it was remains contested, but the hypothesis built around it is one of the most dramatic and divisive ideas in modern science, and it sits at the very heart of the reset theory you are following tonight. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis begins with a simple and striking claim: that the sudden cold snap marking the onset of the Younger Dryas was not caused, or not caused alone, by a disruption of ocean circulation. It was triggered from above. A comet, or perhaps a scattered swarm of cometary fragments, encountered Earth at the end of the last ice age, and either struck or exploded in the atmosphere above the northern hemisphere, releasing energy vast enough to ignite continent-scale wildfires, destabilize the ice sheets, and throw enough material into the upper atmosphere to force a rapid cooling that lasted more than 1,000 years. The researchers who first formally proposed this in 2007 did not present it as speculation. They presented it as evidence. Across dozens of sites stretching from California to the Carolinas, from Belgium to Syria, from Chile to South Africa, they identified a thin dark layer in the sediment record, a boundary marking the exact moment of the Younger Dryas onset. And within that layer, they found things that should not naturally be there: microspherules, tiny glassy beads formed when rock or soil is superheated to temperatures only achievable through impact or explosion. Nanodiamonds, a form of carbon that requires extraordinary pressure to create, the kind of pressure associated with cosmic collisions. Platinum anomalies, elevated concentrations of a metal rare in Earth's crust, but found in higher quantities in certain asteroids and comets. And most visibly, layers rich in charcoal and soot, the signature of fires burning at a scale far beyond anything a normal dry season could produce. The proposed mechanism was not a single mountain-sized rock leaving a crater. It was something subtler and in some ways more terrifying. An airburst, or multiple airbursts, fragments of a fragmented comet detonating in the lower atmosphere, releasing thermal energy across an enormous area without necessarily leaving a conventional impact scar. The same basic phenomenon, though vastly scaled up, as the Tunguska event of 1908, when something exploded above Siberia and flattened 800 square miles of forest without touching the ground. This is where the hypothesis becomes genuinely compelling to some and genuinely infuriating to others. The critics are not quiet. A significant portion of the scientific community has pushed back hard against the impact hypothesis, and their objections are serious. The microspherules and nanodiamonds, they argue, can form through processes that have nothing to do with cosmic impacts. Wildfires, volcanic activity, industrial contamination, and natural chemical processes can all produce similar markers. Several attempts to replicate the original findings at the same sites returned different results. Some researchers could not find the anomalous layers at all. Others found them at depths inconsistent with the proposed timeline. The platinum signal striking when first reported has been challenged on the grounds that terrestrial sources could account for it, and the absence of a clear, unambiguous impact crater or crater field for an event of this proposed scale remains the hypothesis's most persistent problem. A cosmic event powerful enough to trigger a global climate response should, many argue, have left a scar somewhere we can point to. The debate has continued for nearly 2 decades now, growing rather than resolving. New studies appear supporting the hypothesis, new studies appear undermining it. What is clear is that no scientific consensus has formed in either direction, which is itself a meaningful fact. The question remains genuinely open in ways that most questions in geology do not. What makes the celestial mechanism specifically so potent, both in the science and in the mythology that surrounds it, is the character of the violence it implies. A crater from a single large impactor is something the mind can process, a point of contact, a location. But an airburst or a shower of airbursts means fire from everywhere at once, means a sky that burns, means the horizon lights up in every direction, and there is no safe direction to run. To anyone standing on the ground beneath it, it would not have resembled a geological event. It would have resembled the end of everything, and that image, the burning sky, the light that kills, the fire that comes without warning from above, is not absent from human memory. It lives in texts and traditions across cultures that had no contact with one another. It lives in accounts of great destructions that came from the heavens rather than from the earth below. Whether those stories preserve an actual memory of a real event, or whether they represent a more universal human anxiety about the sky, is a question we will return to. But the convergence between what the impact hypothesis proposes and what certain ancient traditions describe is not something the reset theorists have ignored. The deeper question, the one that connects this directly to the larger story, is whether an event of this kind could actually collapse a civilization. Not merely frighten people, not merely cause a bad season, but actually bring down or set back by centuries a complex human society with accumulated knowledge and organized structure. The answer, considered honestly, is yes. It could if the fires were as widespread as the charcoal layers suggest, if the climate disruption was as sharp as the temperature records indicate, if agricultural systems and coastal settlements were already stressed by the warming that preceded this moment. Then a sudden shock from above landing on top of all of that would not need to be a world ender to be a reset. It would only need to be enough to break the thread, enough to scatter what had been gathered, enough that those who came after had to begin again, holding only fragments of what once was, carved into stone or carried in the long, imperfect vessel of human memory. The fire was not the only catastrophe waiting at the edge of the Ice Age. Even without a comet, even without anything falling from the sky, the world that existed 12,000 years ago was already standing at the threshold of an inundation so vast and so slow that most people alive during it probably never understood what was happening to them. They only knew that the sea was rising, that the shore where their grandparents had walked was now gone, that the land their people had lived on for generations was becoming ocean, one season at a time, until there was nothing left to stand on and nowhere left to go but inland, carrying whatever they could carry, leaving everything else to the water. This is the flood after the glaciers. Not a single wave, not a wall of water arriving in a night. Something stranger, and in some ways more relentless than that. At the height of the last ice age, around 20,000 years ago, so much of Earth's water was locked into ice sheets that global sea levels stood somewhere between 300 and 400 feet lower than they are today. Think about what that means in physical terms. The continental shelves, those vast shallow platforms that extend from every coastline before the ocean floor drops away into the deep, were exposed land. The North Sea was a plain. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. The waters between Britain and Europe had not yet opened. What is now the English Channel was walking distance. Southeast Asia was a continent larger than it appears on any modern map. The coastline of North America extended miles further into what is now open Atlantic. These were not marginal strips of beach, they were habitable landscapes with rivers and forests and the kinds of rich, resource-heavy environments where human communities naturally thrive. And they were home. As the glaciers retreated and the ice melted, all of that land began to disappear. The process was not perfectly smooth. Embedded within the general rise of post-glacial sea levels are events that scientists call meltwater pulses, moments when the rate of rise accelerated sharply, likely caused by the sudden collapse of large sections of ice sheet, releasing enormous volumes of meltwater into the ocean in a geologically brief interval. Meltwater Pulse 1A, dated to roughly 14,600 years ago, may have raised sea levels by as much as 40 to 60 feet in just a few centuries, possibly faster. That is a pace of change difficult to fully imagine. Not fast enough to drown a person in an afternoon, but fast enough that within a single lifetime, the geography of a coastline could become unrecognizable. Fast enough to swallow villages, fast enough to end whole ways of life rooted in specific places that no longer existed. Then there are the more localized events, the kinds of regional floods that may have left the deepest marks in human memory. The Black Sea is perhaps the most debated of these. The hypothesis proposed in the late 1990s by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman suggests that around 7,600 years ago, rising Mediterranean waters breached a natural land barrier and poured into what was then a freshwater lake, sitting well below sea level. The inflow would have been dramatic by any measure, gradually transforming a freshwater basin into a saltwater sea, submerging thousands of square miles of shoreline and displacing whatever communities had settled along its edges. Critics of the hypothesis point out that the exact mechanism and timeline remain debated, that the breach may have been slower and less catastrophic than the original proposal suggested. But even the more conservative versions of the Black Sea story describe a landscape transformed within centuries, a shoreline swallowed, a world erased by water. Similar arguments surround other regions. The flooding of the Dogger Bank between Britain and Europe, the submergence of Sunderland in Southeast Asia, the drowning of coastal plains around the Indian subcontinent. Each of these represents not a single disaster, but a long, irreversible process, and each happened within the span of human habitation in those regions. There were people there, and then the water came, and the people moved, and the land they had known became the floor of the sea. What survives of all this is something difficult to measure, but impossible to ignore entirely. The flood traditions. Nearly every culture on Earth carries some version of a great flood story. The most famous in the Western tradition are the biblical account of Noah and the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, which predates the biblical version and shares enough structural detail to suggest a common ancestor in some older, shared tradition. But the flood narrative appears in the oral traditions of indigenous peoples across the Americas, across Australia, across sub-Saharan Africa, across Southeast Asia. The specific details vary wildly: the cause, the hero, the vessel, the survivors. But the core image persists: water rising, land disappearing, a world ending and a remnant surviving to begin again somewhere else. The reset theorists argue that this convergence is not coincidence, that these stories are not metaphors or moral parables invented independently in every corner of the globe, that they are memory, that communities living on the coastlines of the post-glacial world watched the sea take their home, and they encoded that experience in story, and those stories travelled with them, and survived, imperfectly but stubbornly, across hundreds of generations, until someone finally wrote them down. This is a serious argument, and it deserves a serious response. The honest answer is that some of these traditions may indeed preserve genuine cultural memory of real inundation events. Researchers studying Aboriginal Australian oral traditions have found what appear to be accurate descriptions of specific sites now underwater, places that were last dry land thousands of years ago. That is not nothing. That is remarkable. But the leap from local disaster to global deluge is a long one. A community losing its coastline to rising seas is not the same thing as the entire world being swallowed. A regional flood, even a severe and traumatic one, is not evidence of a planetary catastrophe. The flood traditions, taken seriously as cultural memory, point most strongly towards something real but geographically bounded, specific places, specific losses, specific shorelines now lying beneath the ocean, waiting in the dark below the waves. And they are there. The coastlines are real. The drowned landscapes are real. And slowly, methodically, archaeology is beginning to find them. And so we arrive at the stories themselves. Not the coastlines this time, not the rising water or the falling ice, but the thing that human beings did with all of it. What they carried inland when the sea took their homes, what they whispered to their children in the dark, and what their children whispered to theirs until 10,000 years had passed and someone finally pressed the words into clay or cut them into stone, and the rest of the world could hear them for the first time. The stories are everywhere. That is the first thing to understand. You cannot travel to any inhabited region of the world and find a culture without some version of the great undoing. Not just flood, fire too, darkness, a sky that fell silent or turned wrong, an age that ended because something enormous and terrible arrived and swept the slate clean, leaving only a remnant, a seed, a small group of survivors tasked with beginning everything again from nothing. In Mesopotamia, the oldest written version lives in the Epic of Gilgamesh, pressed into tablets thousands of years old. The gods convene and decide to destroy humanity with a flood. One man is warned. He builds a vessel, loads it with living creatures, and rides out the inundation until the waters recede and the world can be entered again. The structural bones of this story are almost identical to the later biblical account of Noah, which scholars broadly agree borrowed from or shared an ancestor with the Mesopotamian tradition. The parallels are not coincidence, they are inheritance, something passed down, reshaped with each generation, but never entirely lost. In Hindu tradition, the figure of Manu survives a great flood with the help of a divine fish, carrying the seeds of future life to dry ground when the waters finally fall. The Mahabharata and the Puranas contain descriptions of ages of the world, vast cosmic cycles called yugas, in which each age declines from a state of perfection until it is destroyed and replaced by a new beginning. The world does not simply continue, it is periodically unmade and remade. Destruction is not an accident, it is a mechanism. The ancient Greeks carried something similar in the myth of Deucalion, warned by Prometheus or by Zeus himself of a coming deluge, surviving in a chest while the world drowned beneath him. But Greek cosmology also contained the myth of Phaethon, the son of the sun who drove the solar chariot too close to the earth and scorched whole continents before Zeus struck him down to prevent total annihilation. Fire from the sky, a world nearly ended by burning before it could be ended by water. The Greeks remembered both, move further, and the pattern does not dissolve. The Aztec cosmology describes a series of 5 suns, 5 successive worlds, each one ending in catastrophe. The first destroyed by jaguars, the second by wind, the third by rain of fire, the fourth by flood. Only the 5th, our present world, remains, and their calendar existed in part to monitor when its end might come. The Maya carried similar structures in their long count, their deep time reckoning, their sense that existence moved in enormous cycles that could terminate. Mesoamerican tradition is saturated with the idea that the world has ended before and will end again, that the present age was built on the ruins of ages that came before and failed. Across the Pacific, Indigenous oral traditions from North America to Australia hold stories of sky fire, of waters rising, of land swallowed by the sea. Some researchers working with Aboriginal Australian communities have documented accounts that appear to describe specific geographical features, particular bays and inlets and headlands, that match locations now submerged under dozens of feet of water. Locations that were last above sea level thousands of years before writing existed anywhere on Earth. If those accounts genuinely encode memories of real places, real shorelines, that is an extraordinary demonstration of what oral tradition can preserve across staggering depths of time. But here is where careful thinking becomes essential. Myth is not history, or more precisely, myth is not literal history, not a transcript, not a documentary record. When cultures encode real environmental events in story, those events pass through layers of meaning-making, symbolic compression, moral framing, and narrative reshaping with every generation that carries them. A coastline lost to rising water becomes a world swallowed by divine punishment. A regional firestorm becomes a cosmic rain of fire sent by angry gods. The emotional truth, the scale of the loss, the terror of the event, those things survive. The specific details, the dates, the geographies, the causes, those things transform. This is not a flaw in oral tradition. It is how oral tradition works. Story is not a filing cabinet. It is a living thing, shaped by the needs of the people carrying it. What survives across hundreds of generations is what mattered most, wrapped in whatever form made it possible to remember and retell. The flood is remembered because floods were catastrophic and real. The fire is remembered because fire fell from somewhere and burned the world. But the story of Deucalion is not a news report, and the 5 suns of Aztec cosmology are not a geological timeline. What is striking and genuinely worth sitting with is the convergence, not because it proves a single global catastrophe that all these traditions remember in parallel. The more honest explanation is that catastrophe itself is universal. Ice Age coastlines were drowned on every continent. Fire and impact events left traces in the sky above every culture. The human experience of living through environmental destruction, of watching a known world end and having to build a new one in its place, is not unique to any geography, but something deeper may be at work as well. The reset narrative, the idea of a previous age destroyed by cosmic forces and replaced by the present imperfect world, speaks to something in the human condition that transcends geography entirely. We have always known, somewhere beneath reason, that what exists can be unmade, that the ground underfoot is not permanent, that the sky above is not safe. The flood stories and the fire stories, and the stories of darkness that covered the earth are not only memory, they are also recognition, a deep encoded understanding that the world as we know it is not the first world, and may not be the last. That understanding was carved into stone and pressed into clay and spoken across 10,000 years of firelit evenings, and it is still here, which means something survived. Something always survives. Even when the world ends, something crosses the water and begins again. And then someone decided to build, not to plant, not to hunt, not simply to survive in the world that remained after the reset, but to drag stone from the earth and raise it toward the sky in arrangements so deliberate, so geometrically precise, so stubbornly permanent that 12,000 years later we are still standing in front of them, asking what they mean. This is where the catastrophe narrative finds its most compelling physical evidence, because the flood stories can be dismissed as metaphor, and the ancient myths can be explained as symbolic, and the drowned coastlines can be attributed to ordinary glacial melt without invoking any lost civilization at all. But the stones are harder to explain away. They are here, they are real, and some of them were raised by people who, according to the conventional timeline, should barely have been capable of building a permanent shelter, let alone an astronomical observatory aligned to the solstice sunrise with a precision that modern engineers still find impressive. Göbekli Tepe is where this argument usually begins, and for good reason. Buried in the hills of what is now southeastern Turkey, this site was excavated starting in the 1990s and immediately unsettled everything. Massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing more than 10 tons, carved with elaborate animal reliefs, arranged in circular enclosures, dating back approximately 12,000 years. 12,000 years. That is not a misprint. At the time Göbekli Tepe was being constructed, the last great ice sheets were still retreating. Agriculture had not yet been invented. The people who built this place were, by every established model, hunter-gatherers, with no cities, no writing, no centralized organization of the kind we associate with monumental architecture. And yet there it stands, or rather, there it was buried deliberately by the people who built it, for reasons we still do not fully understand. For those drawn to reset theories, Göbekli Tepe is not a puzzle. It is a proof, a civilization that understood geometry, that could organize massive collective labor, that carved sophisticated iconography into stone, was active on this earth before the conventional record begins. Whether that civilization survived a cataclysm or was ended by one, the stone suggests it existed. Move forward a few thousand years, and the megalithic tradition spreads across the world in ways that continue to invite questions. Stonehenge on the Salisbury Plain, completed in its final form around 4,000 years ago, but begun much earlier, aligns with the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset in ways that cannot be accidental. The largest stones were transported from sources over 200 miles away. The engineering involved is not primitive. It is deliberate, planned, and executed with a sophistication that implies deep knowledge of the sky, of mathematics, of landscape. At Nabta Playa in the Sahara, a stone circle predating Stonehenge by thousands of years appears aligned to the summer solstice and to specific stars in ways that suggest its builders were careful, systematic observers of celestial movements. The Sahara was not always desert. When Nabta Playa was constructed, that region was a grassland with seasonal lakes, inhabited by cattle-herding peoples who left behind not only stone alignments, but burial sites and evidence of complex ritual life. In Brittany, the stone rows of Karnak stretch across miles of French countryside, thousands of individual standing stones arranged in patterns whose full meaning remains debated, aligned with sunrise and sunset directions, encoding something about the sky that their builders felt compelled to preserve in the most durable medium available. And durability is the point. Stone does not rot. Stone does not burn. Stone does not wash away in a single flood or dissolve into the earth over a few centuries. When you want to leave something for the world that comes after yours, something that will outlast every political system and every oral tradition and every fragile scroll, you carve it or raise it or arrange it in stone. The people who built these monuments knew on some level that what they were making was meant to endure, not just for their grandchildren, for everyone who would ever come after. This is where the theory of pre-cataclysm knowledge becomes seductive. If a civilization existed before the Great Reset, before the fires and the floods and the 1,000-year winter, and if some survivors carried its knowledge into the world that came after, what better way to preserve it than in stone circles aligned to the permanent movements of the sky? The stars do not change on human timescales. The solstices repeat. The equinoxes return. Build your archive in alignments to those eternal recurrences, and you have written something that any sufficiently careful observer in any future age will eventually be able to read. But here is what the stones cannot tell us, and this matters as much as what they can. Remarkable engineering is not the same as lost global civilization. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were extraordinary. The people who moved the bluestones to Salisbury Plain were extraordinary. The builders of Nabta Playa and Karnak and the hundreds of other megalithic sites scattered across every inhabited continent were extraordinary. But extraordinary does not require a vanished predecessor. Human beings, even without writing or cities or metal tools, are capable of breathtaking collective achievement when sufficiently motivated by belief, by ritual, by the desire to mark the sky and honour the dead and make the sacred visible. The gap between impressive stone architecture and a sophisticated global civilization that was erased by catastrophe is enormous, and the stones alone cannot bridge it. What they show us is that very early human communities cared deeply about the cosmos, understood celestial movement well enough to encode it in permanent stone, and possessed organizational capacity that we are only beginning to appreciate fully. That is a profound and genuine discovery. It does not require a hidden predecessor civilization to be astonishing. What it does require is humility. The conventional story, the one that begins civilization with writing and farming and walls, has always been too narrow. The stones knew that before we did. They have been waiting 12,000 years for us to catch up. And if the stone circles of Europe and Turkey are the opening argument, Egypt is where the debate becomes a full confrontation. Because Egypt is different, not just in scale, though the scale alone is enough to stop thought in its tracks. Different in the way it sits at the intersection of everything the reset theory is trying to prove. Old enough to matter, precise enough to inspire awe. And according to some researchers, possibly older than anyone with institutional authority is prepared to admit. The Great Sphinx of Giza crouches at the edge of the plateau, like something that has been waiting for a question. It has been waiting a long time. The orthodox date for its construction places it in the reign of Pharaoh Khafra, roughly 4,500 years ago, carved from the limestone bedrock of the plateau during a period of remarkable Egyptian power and ambition. This is the consensus. It is supported by historical texts, by proximity to Khafra's mortuary complex, by the proportions of the face, by decades of careful archaeological work. And then a geologist named Robert Schoch looked at the erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure walls and said something that cracked the argument open. What Schoch observed, beginning in the early 1990s, was that the weathering on the Sphinx and the walls of its surrounding pit did not look like wind erosion. Wind erosion produces horizontal striations, sharp edges, a scouring quality. What he saw instead was deep vertical undulation, rounded channels, a pattern he associated with prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall. Rainfall substantial enough, sustained enough, to carve stone. The kind of rainfall that Egypt has not experienced for thousands of years. The Sahara has been largely arid for around 5,000 years, with the wetter period before that, known as the African humid period, fading gradually between roughly 8 and 5,000 years ago. If the erosion on the Sphinx reflects rainfall rather than wind, Schoch argued, then the monument may predate the drying of the Sahara by a significant margin. Not 4,500 years old, possibly 7,000 years old, possibly older, possibly as old as the very edge of the catastrophe window the reset theorists are drawing around. Egyptologists push back hard, and not without reason. Other structures on the Giza plateau show similar weathering without anyone proposing radical redating. Salt exfoliation, differential hardness of the limestone layers, and the complex microclimate of the enclosure pit can all produce erosion patterns that superficially resemble water damage. The absence of any other archaeological evidence for a sophisticated culture in Egypt 10 or 12,000 years ago is not a small objection. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the erosion debate, fascinating as it is, remains exactly that, a debate, not a resolution. But the Sphinx is only one piece of the puzzle Egypt presents. The pyramids of Giza are, by almost any measure, among the most precisely engineered structures ever built by human hands. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, constructed around 4,500 years ago, according to the conventional timeline, contains more than 2 million stone blocks, some weigh over 80 tons. The structure is oriented to the cardinal directions, with an accuracy of a tiny fraction of a single degree. The base is level to within a few centimetres across its entire 230-metre span. The internal chambers and passages are aligned to specific stars in ways that appear intentional. The mathematics implied by its dimensions have prompted claims, sometimes credible and sometimes wildly overstated, that its builders encoded knowledge of the Earth's circumference, of pi, of astronomical cycles into the structure itself. None of this is disputed in terms of physical fact. What is disputed is what it means. For reset theorists, the precision of the pyramids points toward knowledge that should not have been available to a civilization supposedly just a few centuries old at the time of construction. The organizational capacity required to feed, house and coordinate tens of thousands of workers across decades of continuous effort implies a bureaucratic and logistical sophistication that does not emerge from nowhere. The astronomical alignments imply an accumulated body of sky knowledge far older than the monuments themselves. Where did it come from? The reset narrative has a ready answer. It came from before. From the civilization that the catastrophe erased, passed down through survivors, encoded into these permanent structures precisely because their builders understood how fragile memory is and how permanent stone is. Egyptologists have a different answer, and it is more supported by evidence than the alternative narrative sometimes acknowledges. Egypt did not appear from nowhere. Its pyramid-building tradition evolved visibly, from mastaba tombs to step pyramids to the first attempts at smooth-sided forms, some of which famously failed before the builders refined their technique. We can watch the learning curve in the archaeology. We can read the administrative papyri that detail workforce organization. We have graffiti left by the work gangs, jokes scratched into stone by the men who actually built these things. The evidence for a gradual, human, historically traceable process of development is real. But here is the uncomfortable truth that both sides sometimes prefer to avoid. Gradual development and genuine mystery are not mutually exclusive. The pyramids can be the product of a historically traceable Egyptian civilization and still represent an engineering achievement that raises legitimate questions about the depth and origin of the knowledge involved. These do not have to be the same argument. Egypt becomes the central battleground between conventional and alternative timelines precisely because it is spectacular enough to inspire wonder and old enough to brush against the edges of the catastrophe window. It sits at the point where genuine archaeological uncertainty meets the human need for a grander story. The erosion debate is real. The precision is real. The questions about the origin and transmission of astronomical knowledge are real. What is not yet real is the evidence for a lost super-civilization, sophisticated enough to have taught the Egyptians everything they knew. The mystery is genuine. The proposed solution remains, for now, a story we are telling ourselves in the dark beside the stones. The stones of Egypt stand above the sand, visible, arguable, available to anyone with the patience to look. But there is another category of evidence in the reset conversation, one that is harder to reach and harder to dispute and harder to verify in equal measure. Evidence that is not above the ground at all. It is beneath the water. When the glaciers retreated and the sea rose, it did not rise over empty coastline. People had been living on those coasts for thousands of years. They had built fires there, buried their dead, raised their shelters, perhaps carved their stories into stone. All of that was swallowed. The world's continental shelves, those broad, shallow margins that ring the continents before the ocean floor drops away into the deep, represent an enormous area of drowned land. Roughly 27 million square kilometres of territory that was once above water is now submerged. That is a landmass comparable in total area to North America, and most of it has never been excavated or even properly surveyed. This is not a fringe idea. It is basic geology. The sea level rise that followed the end of the last glacial maximum was real dramatic, and transformative. Between about 20,000 years ago and 6,000 years ago, ocean levels rose by roughly 120 meters, not all at once, not smoothly, but relentlessly. Coastlines moved inland, river mouths drowned, bays opened where valleys had been. The people living on those coasts either moved or were overwhelmed, and whatever they left behind is now sitting in darkness, under fathoms of water. So the question is not whether submerged landscapes exist. They do. The question is what is actually in them. Off the southern tip of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni, a structure sits on the seafloor at a depth of about 5 to 25 meters. It was first noticed by divers in the 1980s. What they found was extraordinary enough to generate genuine scientific debate and a great deal of unscientific enthusiasm. The structure, if that is the right word, consists of large flat terraced platforms, right angles, what appear to be staircases, a formation that has been called an altar, and surfaces that seem almost impossibly regular. Photographs of it are striking. It looks in many images like something that was built. The debate about Yonaguni has never been cleanly resolved. Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist at the University of the Ryukyus, argued for decades that it represents the remains of a human-made structure, dating back thousands of years, potentially predating the sea rise that submerged it. Other geologists, including Robert Schoch, who had already made his name in Giza, examined the site and came to different conclusions. Schoch in particular argued that while the site is genuinely interesting, the features most consistent with natural formation make a purely geological explanation plausible. Sandstone is known to fracture along clean plains and right angles under the right conditions. Terracing can form naturally. The features that look like staircases may be exactly the kind of illusion that human pattern recognition is designed at its most fundamental level to produce. This is one of the central difficulties with underwater archaeology, and it cannot be overstated. The human brain is extraordinarily good at finding shapes, structures, faces, and intentions in things that have no conscious origin. We see animals in clouds, we see messages in random static. When we dive to the ocean floor and find angular formations, our minds reach immediately for the explanation that someone made them, because that is what angular formations have usually meant across all of our evolutionary history. The ocean does not share our bias. It produces right angles too. Off the coast of India, near the ancient city of Dwarka on the Gulf of Kambat, underwater surveys have identified stone structures that appear to be genuinely artificial. Artifacts, including pottery and wooden pieces, have been recovered. The site attracted considerable excitement when announced in 2002, with some researchers claiming it represented a city drowned at the end of the Ice Age, potentially 9,000 years old or older. The Indian government launched formal investigations. The results were more complicated than the initial headlines suggested. Dating of the organic material was disputed. The methodology of some surveys was criticised. The site remains real, the structures appear genuine in at least some areas, but the extraordinary age claims have not been independently confirmed to the satisfaction of the broader scientific community. In the waters off Cuba in the early 2000s, a Canadian exploration company reported sonar images of what appeared to be a grid of structures on the seafloor at depths of around 600 to 700 meters. The geometry looked urban. The images circulated. Scientists pointed out that the depth makes a glacial era origin implausible, since the sea was never low enough to expose that particular seafloor within any human time frame. Geological formation remained the more parsimonious explanation. Follow-up investigation has been limited. What all of these sites share is something important. They exist at the intersection of genuine underwater geography, the documented reality of drowned coastlines, and the limits of what we can actually verify from beneath the water. Underwater excavation is slow, expensive, technically demanding, and subject to distortions of visibility and access that would be unthinkable on a dry land site. Dating organic material recovered from the seafloor is complicated by contamination and redeposition. Distinguishing natural and cultural features requires extended, methodical study that is far harder to fund and execute than a dramatic dive with a camera. The honest answer about what lies on the continental shelves is that we largely do not know. There almost certainly are remnants of genuine prehistoric habitation down there. Not lost cities of high civilization, not the architectural monuments of an advanced global culture, but the ordinary traces of coastal peoples who lived and fished and built modest structures along shores that are now underwater. Evidence of ordinary life at the margin of the sea. This would be valuable beyond measure, not because it confirms a reset theory, but because it represents an enormous gap in our understanding of human prehistory that we have barely begun to address. The drowned coastlines are real. The loss is real. What they most likely contain, if we could look properly, is not the smoking proof of a vanished civilization, sophisticated enough to have changed everything we know. It is something smaller and in its own way more haunting. The everyday traces of people who lived exactly as we would expect people to live, on shores that the sea eventually swallowed, leaving almost nothing above the waterline to prove they were ever there at all. And then there is the sky. The drowned coastlines hold what they hold in silence and darkness, inaccessible. But the sky has always been there, open, readable, cycling overhead with a precision that no flood can touch and no ice can bury. And the people who built in stone, across dozens of cultures and thousands of years, watched it obsessively. They tracked it. They encoded it. They carved its movements into the most permanent material they could find. And this is where another strand of the reset conversation quietly begins. The claim is this: that ancient monuments are not merely temples or tombs or ceremonial plazas. They are warnings, calendars of catastrophe, cut into rock by people who knew that the sky moved in great cycles, that those cycles had brought destruction before, and that they would bring it again. The stones on this reading are not celebrating the gods, they are recording a countdown. To understand why this idea takes root so easily, you have to start with something that is genuinely true. Ancient peoples had extraordinary astronomical knowledge, not theoretical, observational, practical. Knowledge built from generations of watching the same sky from the same locations, with nothing to do in the darkness, but look and remember and pass the pattern on. The alignment of Stonehenge's main axis with the midsummer sunrise is real. The orientation of the great temples at Karnak toward the winter solstice sunrise has been confirmed by archaeoastronomers. The avenue at Newgrange in Ireland funnels a narrow beam of light to its innermost chamber on the morning of the winter solstice, just once a year, with an accuracy that required careful planning. These are not coincidences, they are architecture. What the builders of these structures understood, to varying degrees across cultures and centuries, is that the sky moves in nested cycles. The daily arc of the sun, the monthly phases of the moon, the annual wheel of the seasons. These are the obvious ones, the rhythms any agricultural society must master simply to survive. But there is a longer cycle, far slower, far stranger, and far more significant for the reset conversation. It is called the precession of the equinoxes. The Earth does not spin on a perfectly fixed axis. It wobbles like a top that is beginning to slow. This wobble traces a vast circle over approximately 26,000 years. The effect of this is that the stars appear to drift gradually against the background of the sky, so slowly that no single human lifetime would notice it without records kept across generations. The point in the sky that the North Pole points toward shifts. The position of the sun against the background stars at the spring equinox moves, very slowly, through all 12 signs of what we now call the zodiac. One full cycle takes about 26,000 years. 1/12 of that cycle the passage through a single zodiac sign takes roughly 2,160 years. This is a real phenomenon, it is measurable, and there is genuine scholarly debate about how early various ancient cultures detected and understood it. Some researchers have argued that precession was known far earlier than the conventional timeline suggests, encoded not in written texts, but in mythology, in the careful numerical frameworks of ancient cosmology in the proportions of monuments. This is where the terrain becomes much harder to navigate, because pattern seeking is not the same as pattern finding. The human mind is a meaning-making instrument of extraordinary sensitivity and sometimes extraordinary overreach. When you look at the Mesoamerican long count calendar and notice that its great cycle of roughly 5,125 years bears some relationship to a fraction of the precessional cycle, you can choose to read that as evidence of deep astronomical wisdom encoding a catastrophe forecast. Or you can ask whether the relationship is as precise as claimed, whether the numerical correspondence survives rigorous scrutiny, whether the original designers of the calendar described it in terms of celestial catastrophe at all. The answers to those questions are considerably more complicated than the theory requires. The Maya calendar is genuinely remarkable. It tracks multiple interlocking cycles of time with a sophistication that scholars have spent careers analysing. The famous end date of the long count calendar, which passed in December 2012 without incident, was interpreted by some researchers and a great many filmmakers as a coded warning about cyclical destruction. What Maya scholars actually say is more careful. The long count marks the completion of a great cycle, comparable roughly to how we might mark the turning of a millennium. The ancient Maya texts that reference the end of previous world ages do describe cataclysmic transitions, but they also describe renewal, continuation, the beginning of a new count. It is a cyclical cosmology, not a termination notice. Egyptian temple orientations are real and have been studied seriously for decades. The field of archaeoastronomy, which examines the relationship between ancient monuments and celestial events, is a legitimate discipline with peer-reviewed journals and careful methodologies. What it has established is that many ancient builders paid close attention to solar and lunar alignments, sometimes with a remarkable precision. What it has not established, despite the claims made in various popular books, is that these alignments encode specific forecasts of future destruction keyed to precessional timing. The distinction matters enormously. Knowing that the sky moves in grand cycles is not the same thing as predicting that those cycles will bring catastrophe. Cyclical cosmologies, the idea that time moves in great turning wheels of creation and destruction, are found across many ancient cultures. They reflect something true about human experience. Seasons end and return. Generations rise and fall. Empires crumble and others take their place. The cyclical framework is a profound and emotionally resonant way of understanding a world that does change, that does bring loss, that does sometimes feel like it is ending. But there is a long road between a cosmology of cycles and a specific astronomical clock set to trigger at the moment a certain star rises over a certain horizon. The stones record genuine knowledge of the sky. They encode the seasons, the cardinal directions, the movements of sun and moon across years and decades. What they do not do, under any methodology that survives scrutiny, is provide a calendar for the next extinction. The sky they were watching was real. The cycles they recorded were real. The warning that some read in those records is a reflection of something else, something deeply human, the need to believe that if catastrophe is coming, someone somewhere left us a sign. And yet the stones point somewhere, not to the future perhaps, but to the past, to the question that quietly underlies almost everything in this conversation. Who built these things, and where did they learn to do it? Because here is the claim that sits at the centre of the Great Reset theory, the one that draws everything else into orbit around it. Before the floods, before the ice retreated, before the cities we know about, Sumer and Egypt and the Indus Valley, there was something else. A civilization older than our oldest names for civilization, advanced enough to understand the sky, to move stone with precision, to encode knowledge into architecture that could survive millennia. A civilization that the catastrophe erased, leaving only fragments, echoes, the faintest impressions pressed into the margins of human memory. The reset on this reading was not just a geological event, it was the end of a world that had already figured some things out. This is a genuinely compelling idea. It is also an idea that requires careful handling, because the difference between a compelling story and a defensible historical claim is exactly the kind of distinction the stones themselves seem to resist. The popular arguments for a lost Ice Age civilization tend to cluster around three observations. First, that certain architectural achievements appear too suddenly, without the gradual developmental phases you would expect if a culture were inventing something from scratch. Second, that strikingly similar motifs, structures, and mythological figures appear across cultures that had no known contact with each other. And third, that across many ancient traditions, there are stories of a great teacher figure, a bringer of civilization, who arrived from somewhere else, often from across the sea, and gave a primitive people the gifts of agriculture, architecture, law, and calendar. The Sumerians had Oans, the part-man part-fish being who emerged from the waters and taught all civilized arts. Mesoamerican traditions spoke of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, as a civilizing presence. Ancient Egyptian mythology placed a foundational age of wisdom in a period called Zep Tepi, the first time. The pattern, the argument goes, is too consistent to be coincidence. Someone was teaching, someone had already learned. The diffusionist explanation, the idea that a single mother culture spread its knowledge outward before being destroyed, is attractive precisely because it is elegant. One source, many recipients, one catastrophe to explain the silence in the record. But elegance is not evidence, and the competing explanation, independent invention, is not as weak as the reset narrative often suggests. Humans everywhere face the same problems. How to grow food reliably, how to track the seasons, how to build structures that would last, that would signal meaning and order against the chaos of an uncertain world. When you give the same problem to intelligent minds operating under similar constraints, similar solutions tend to emerge. Pyramidal forms appear in Egypt and Mesoamerica, not necessarily because someone taught both cultures to build pyramids, but because a pyramid is one of the most structurally stable ways to stack stone into a lasting vertical monument. The circle is a natural form for communal gathering. Solar alignment is an obvious goal for any culture that depends on agriculture and needs to track the year. The convergences that seem so startling become considerably less mysterious when you account for the fact that human beings, everywhere and always, are solving the same basic equations. That said, the independent invention argument has its own limits. Some of the parallels are precise enough to deserve scrutiny. Some architectural choices, symbolic systems, and numerical frameworks are specific enough that identical independent development strains credibility in certain cases. The honest position is that neither pure diffusionism nor pure independent invention fully accounts for everything we observe in the ancient record. The real picture was almost certainly messier, more local, more contingent than either theory prefers. But here is the deeper problem for the lost civilization hypothesis, and it is a problem the theory itself identifies and then partially deflects. What would it take to prove it? Archaeological evidence requires things that survive, written records, durable artifacts, building foundations, middens and tools and bones and seeds, a civilization sophisticated enough to build the monuments attributed to it would have left traces in multiple categories, not just in the alignments of later structures it supposedly influenced, but in its own physical remains, And those remains, the hypothesis answers, are underwater. This is not an unreasonable claim. It is genuinely true. The coastlines of the late Ice Age world sat as much as 400 feet below current sea level in some regions. When the glaciers melted, those coastal zones drowned. Gradually, over millennia, but completely, any settlements built on those shorelines, and coastal living was enormously attractive to Ice Age peoples. For the same reasons it is attractive today, would now be submerged. Archaeology struggles enormously with underwater sites. They are expensive to locate, expensive to excavate, difficult to date, and easy to misinterpret. The absence of evidence in this case genuinely is not the same as evidence of absence. But the argument cuts both ways. Preservation bias is real, but it is also invoked selectively. Yes, coastal sites are gone, but inland sites are not all gone. If a civilization sophisticated enough to seed global culture once existed, it was not living exclusively on coastlines. Settlements of any scale leave marks in the landscape, in pollen records, in isotope signatures, in ancient sediments, in the DNA of domesticated plants and animals. The absence of those inland signatures in the pre-12,000-year record is harder to explain away with a rising sea. What the current evidence actually supports is this: multiple regional populations, independently and in loose contact with each other, developed increasingly complex behaviours across the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. Agriculture emerged, probably more than once, in more than one place, under pressures that were partly climatic and partly social. Monument building arose in different forms, across different cultures, with different timelines. The pattern looks less like a single candle lighting many flames, and more like kindling that was ready across the whole world, waiting only for the right combination of conditions to catch. That does not mean nothing was lost. Things were certainly lost. Populations vanished. Knowledge died with its keepers. Entire ways of life, the glacial retreat erased without ceremony or record. The reset, whatever form it took, cost the world something. The question is whether what was lost was a mother civilization, or simply the ordinary, irreplaceable complexity of human lives that never needed to be extraordinary to matter. There is a reason this conversation keeps happening. Not just in fringe corners of the internet, not just among people who distrust official narratives, but in living rooms and late-night rabbit holes and the quiet hours when sleep refuses to come. The Great Reset theory, in all its variations, returns with a persistence that feels almost geological. It erodes, retreats, and then flows back. And if you want to understand why, you have to stop asking whether the theory is true and start asking what it does for the people who believe it. Because stories about broken history are not just claims about the past, they are claims about the present. And the present is frightening in ways that are very easy to see. Think about what it feels like to live inside a civilization that knows, in some dim official corner of its awareness, that it is vulnerable. The same scientific consensus that calls the Great Reset theory unproven also tells us that the climate is changing faster than most life can adapt to, that ecosystems are collapsing in ways that will not reverse on any human timescale, that the systems we depend on, agricultural, political, financial, are more fragile than their surfaces suggest. We live in a world that has recently discovered its own fragility, and into that discovery, the reset narrative arrives with a strange kind of comfort. Because if civilization was already destroyed once and human beings survived, built again, carved their grief and their genius into stone, then perhaps this is not the end. Perhaps we are not the first people to stand at the edge of a world coming apart. Perhaps someone always makes it through. That is not denial. It is something more nuanced than denial. It is the ancient human need to locate yourself inside a story that has already been told, that has already survived its worst chapter. Catastrophe myths across cultures serve exactly this function. They do not only describe destruction, They describe the person who carries the seeds, the boat that holds the breeding pairs, the teacher who arrives afterward with the memory of what was lost. The reset narrative always includes a remnant, always, because a story with no remnant is not a story anyone can live inside. The internet era accelerated all of this in ways that would have been impossible to predict even 30 years ago. Alternative archaeology was always present. Graham Hancock and his predecessors existed before the algorithm, before the comments section, before the YouTube recommendation spiral. But the internet gave this body of ideas something it had never had before, which is an audience that compounds. Every documentary watched generates 3 more suggested. Every forum thread multiplies. Every person who finds the ideas compelling and shares them becomes an unpaid distributor. The grand hidden history narrative is, structurally speaking, perfectly suited to internet propagation. It has mystery. It has suppressed knowledge. It has a villain, usually institutional science, portrayed as incurious or conspiratorial. It has a hero, usually the independent researcher with open eyes. It hits every note that makes content travel. And yet it would be too easy, and frankly, too dishonest, to dismiss the appeal as purely algorithmic. The people drawn to these ideas are often genuinely curious about the deep past in ways that academic archaeology sometimes fails to meet. There is a real gap between what specialists know and how that knowledge reaches the public. Peer-reviewed literature is not designed for wonder. It is designed for precision, for caution, for the careful and often beautiful business of not claiming more than the evidence allows. That caution is scientifically necessary and emotionally unsatisfying in equal measure. When someone reads a journal article saying the evidence for complex symbolic behavior at a particular site is ambiguous and contested, and then watches a documentary saying ancient builders were encoding the precession of the equinoxes into the geometry of their monuments, the documentary wins every time. Not because people are foolish, but because human beings are narrative animals, and the documentary is speaking the right language. Science earns its authority through a process that is slow, self-correcting, and deliberately undramatic. The Great Reset theory earns its audience through a process that is immediate, emotionally resonant, and structured like a thriller. These are not competing on equal terms, and they never were. But here is the thing, that the stones themselves contribute to this imbalance, and it matters. Stone monuments are durable. That is why we are still talking about them. They survived because they were built to survive, or because they were massive enough that time could not fully erase them. And their durability creates a particular kind of silence. The stones are present, but their makers are not. The architecture remains, but the conversation around it is gone. And that silence, that beautiful, unreadable silence, is exactly the kind of space human imagination floods to fill. When you stand before something ancient and enormous and cannot fully explain it, the incompleteness is not a flaw in the evidence, it is an invitation. And different people accept that invitation differently. The archaeologist tries to fill the silence with data, with careful inference, with the humility of partial answers. The Great Reset theorist fills it with a story that makes the silence feel meaningful rather than merely incomplete. Both are responding to the same provocation. The stone does not prefer one response over the other. The stone does not answer. This is why uncertainty keeps the theory alive more reliably than any evidence could. Every gap in the official record is a doorway. Every site that raises more questions than it resolves is fuel. The more honestly science admits that it does not fully understand the deep past, the more room the alternative narrative finds to breathe. Certainty would end this conversation. Certainty is not available. And so, the Great Reset theory continues. Not as a finished argument, but as a living question. A question that says something real about the people asking it, about what they fear, about what they need history to mean, about what it feels like to be a fragile creature living inside an apparently fragile world, reaching back through 12,000 years of silence, hoping that something in the stone might reach back. And so we arrive at the edge of what we actually know, not the edge of what has been imagined or theorized or passionately argued in documentaries and late-night forums. The edge of what the evidence, examined honestly and without the pressure to reach a dramatic conclusion, can genuinely support. Start with what is solid. There were catastrophes, real ones, enormous ones, the kind that reshaped coastlines and ended ecosystems and forced human societies to rebuild from almost nothing. The Younger Dryas was real, a sudden and savage cold snap that interrupted a warming world roughly 12,000 years ago and lasted more than 1,000 years before releasing its grip. The flooding of coastal land as glaciers melted was real, slow by human standards, but relentless, swallowing hundreds of miles of territory over generations, drowning whatever settlements existed at the margins where people preferred to live. Abrupt climate shifts are not a theory. They are written in ice cores and ocean sediment, and the chemical memory of ancient soil. The world at the end of the last ice age was genuinely and repeatedly catastrophic for the creatures living through it. These are not small concessions. They are the foundation of something true and worth taking seriously. Humanity did survive an age of profound instability. Our ancestors carried their knowledge and their stories through conditions that were not friendly to survival. Some of what they remembered they encoded, in ritual, in myth, in stone. Where the evidence softens into speculation is in the architecture built on top of that foundation. The leap from real catastrophes to a single unified global civilization, technologically sophisticated and comprehensively erased, requires connections the physical record does not yet provide. Similar construction techniques in distant cultures may reflect parallel solutions to shared physical problems rather than a shared origin. Astronomical alignments in ancient monuments may reflect careful observation rather than encoded warnings from a lost age. Underwater structures may be natural formations interpreted through the lens of desire. Each of these possibilities deserves investigation. None of them at present constitutes proof. There is a difference between those three words that matters more than almost anything else in this conversation. Possibility, probability, and proof are not points on the same line. A thing can be genuinely possible, even genuinely interesting, while remaining unproven, and that distance cannot be collapsed by enthusiasm alone. What the stones can say is this: people have been marking time and encoding meaning for far longer than our standard histories once assumed. They built in ways that demanded cooperation, planning, and a rich inner world. They looked at the sky and understood it. They survived disasters that would have broken later civilizations entirely, and they kept going, kept building, kept reaching upward with their hands and their ideas. That is not a small story. That is, in fact, one of the most extraordinary stories there is. What the stones cannot say, at least not yet, is who taught them, or whether a mother civilization lies waiting beneath the ocean, or whether the Great Reset was a single event with a single source. The stones hold memory without releasing all of it. They are patient in a way that human curiosity is not. They have survived ice and flood and the long grinding patience of time, and they will outlast the arguments we build around them. They do not confirm the reset theory. They do not refute the wonder that inspired it. What they tell us quietly, in the calm register that suits the deepest hours of the night, is that human beings have always been here, at the edge of catastrophe, and have always found a way to begin again, to cut the next stone, to raise the next wall, to carry the memory of everything lost into the foundation of everything new. That is enough. That is perhaps everything.